Welcome to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's Stories of Impact project from the UK delegation and the Association of Jewish Refugees. I'm Alex Maws.
And from the Canadian delegation and the Azrieli Foundation's Holocaust Survivor Memoirs program, I'm Jody Speak.
And we are really pleased to be joined today by our guest, Dr. Robert Williams from the USC Shoah Foundation, who is also the academic advisor to the IHRA. Rob, thank you for joining us.
Thank you both for having me. It's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. Rob, today we wanted to pick your brain over something that's been challenging Holocaust education organizations over the last number of years. With the rising contemporary anti-Semitism, what to what extent is it the job of Holocaust education programs and organizations to educate against contemporary anti-Semitism when we're so struggling to stay rooted in the context and the information around the Holocaust to create that modern day connection? So can you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on that?
Listen, I think in many ways, the promise of Holocaust education as it was imagined 30, 40 years ago, when a lot of the larger museums in the world and institutions were coming into being, was that learning about the Holocaust would inoculate wide audiences against anti Semitism in a variety of forms. And that wasn't the only goal, of course, but I think that was one of the goals. And I think to a certain extent that was successful, at least in the early years, right? When you look at early Holocaust education efforts, particularly when they emphasized hatred of the Jews and the horrible outcomes that it led to during the years of National Socialism, you saw a greater awareness of extreme right wing forms of anti Semitism begin to form in the minds of not just the youth, but in political leaders and others who are tasked with protecting our society. You saw the decline of a particularly pernicious form of anti Semitism that we call Holocaust denial. You saw broad success. But with that, it also kind of closed our eyes to the other types of anti Semitism that exist out there. We began to believe, for lack of a better analogy, that every anti Semite was a guy wearing a swastika armband. And as long as you weren't wearing a swastika armband, you were one of the goodies. What we've seen really since 2014, 2015 is that myopia has come back to bite us. We've seen, of course, a huge rise in extremist right-wing anti-Semitism that takes the form of violent attacks. This is something perhaps most common in the United States, where we've had one shooting after another of Jewish community or centers and institutions, by and large, not exclusively, but by and large, perpetrated by right-wing extremists. But we've also seen the resurgence of the oldest form of anti-Jewish bias that is mostly hardline Roman Catholic, but also other forms of hardline Christian anti-Semitism begin to rise in countries like France and the United States and a few other, Italy. You've seen, of course, the perhaps the most obvious form of politicized religious anti-Semitism in the form of extreme Islamism lead to violent attacks against Jews, both in the diaspora and in the Jewish state of Israel. And you've seen the really strong resurgence, something that we haven't seen since the fall of the Soviet Union, the extremely strong resurgence of a left wing form of anti Semitism that, in a way, allies itself with the Islamist forms. But interestingly enough, and Jody being from Canada, I think you've seen this closer than many of us, can also lead to left wing anti Semites rallying with right wing anti Semites at the same time. And this is an extremely dangerous mix because you have the right wing extremists who are probably more likely to commit violence, at least statistically, in what we'll call the Atlantic world. You have religious extremists who will also not be shy from violence, depending on the background. And then you have left wing extremists who bring with them the risk of normalizing this hatred. So, going back to your core question, where does the Holocaust fit in this? It's all in how we teach the subject of the Holocaust. If we are only teaching it from a top-down perspective of the Nazi imposition of authoritarian rule, marginalization of the Jews, and marginalization of other communities, I don't think we'll be able to open people's eyes to all the forms of anti-Semitism that are out there. But if we merge that with a more bottom-up approach, where you look at the ubiquity of anti-Semitism among not just the German population, but the populations of the countries occupied by the Nazis and their collaborators, then you get a sense of just how widespread anti-Semitism really is and a better sense of how to recognize it. The last thing I'll say, and then I know I'll try to keep it brief, we also have to contend with the reality that since effectively 1948, we've witnessed the rise of a new variant of anti-Semitism, that which masks itself at times through criticism of the state of Israel and anti-Zionism. Now, this is a different type of anti-Semitism. It's one that the wider public often can't recognize as well, in part because it's merged with contemporary politics and a lack of understanding about complex situations in a region of the world far, far away from the Western gaze. But nevertheless, I think what we've seen is forms of anti-Semitism that are masked as critique of the state of Israel. These are types that cross a threshold into being outright defamatory toward Jews, is something that Holocaust education per se cannot contend with. So the responsibility of an ethical approach to Holocaust education is to say, understanding the Holocaust can allow us to understand the ramifications of hatred of the Jews. But at the end of the day, if we define the Holocaust as the period between 1941 and 1945 that led to the mass murder of approximately 6 million Jews across Europe and parts of North Africa, that's 4 years in at least, we all argue about when anti-Semitism began. I start around the year 300 BC. So let's say at least 2,300 years of anti-Jewish violence. And you're not going to be able to understand the whole if you only understand 4 years.
Thank you. I think you make an interesting point, though, that since 1948 and what we've been seeing recently has been fear of criticism of the state of Israel, sort of going down that slope, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Those argue that they're different things. We know from the IHRA definition that holding Israel to a different standard is a form of anti-Semitism. With that, Holocaust education organizations that are truly grounded in those 4 years, I would argue maybe 33 to 45, it predated the state of Israel and didn't predate the Jewish people or the Jewish connection to the state of Israel. But it is a conversation that I'm currently having with Holocaust educators on how to properly bring this in at all. If I properly teach the Holocaust and end at liberation, or even in 1946 with what happened, and even in Canada, if we continue even to 1947 with the war orphans who came, we still can avoid the entire topic of Israel and down that road of anti-Semitism. And so there are different views and there's a lack of nuance when it comes to teaching it that I think people are struggling with. What would you say to that?
If you look at the history of the Holocaust and the European Jewish experience of the Holocaust, you of course have all the atrocities, all the fear, all of the horror that the Holocaust was. But if you look at it from, let's say, 10,000 feet, you also notice something very important, something that also explains the necessity of the state of Israel. For all intents and purposes, the European countries where Jews had lived for effectively 2,000 years, at least in the case of Italy, abandoned their Jewish communities. So you, of course, have the perpetrator states that targeted Jews. That's the most obvious form of abandonment. You have the, by and large, liberal democracies of Western Europe and the United States that failed to adequately open their immigration rolls to allow more Jews to flee. The failure of the Evian Conference is a good case in point. You have in other countries, some of the same countries, in fact, actively appeasing Nazi Germany by either treating everything as normal or thinking that they can give just a couple inches to these far-right extremists and everything will be fine. The Munich conference is a good case in point, and I'm not just picking on the UK here. There were other allies involved in that terrible effort. And you have all of the neutral countries, many of which did not let Jews in, but several of which profited off of Nazi crimes. So if you look at the European continent as a whole, and I'll throw Britain and Ireland into the mix with that, you have abandonment, failure, the de facto message that Jews really aren't that important. This is the message of 1945. That was learned by 1945, let's say. So, absent a place to return, and the fact that those few Jews who survived, who did try to return, were often met with forms of violence as well, where else are they going to go? The reality of the Holocaust made the reestablishment of the state of Israel a necessity, something that had been discussed and in some ways promised for the better part of a century, suddenly became a necessity because there was nowhere else to go. That sense of abandonment required 1948.
Thank you, Rob. I mean, there's so much there to try and pick up on. There is a lot of popular discourse. I don't know to what extent it's discourse amongst experts and academics and researchers or not, that basically says, well, you've got two trends that are intersecting. On the one hand, you've got a surge in anti-Semitism, and also we are, 30 years or so into an era of really prioritizing teaching and learning about the Holocaust. So the conclusion we must be able to draw is that Holocaust education does not work when it comes to curing anti-Semitism. I'm saying that in exaggerated quotes on purpose. What do you say to that? I mean, should it be the responsibility of Holocaust education to take on that burden, or does that possibly belong somewhere else in the curriculum?
The reality is Holocaust education is an intrinsic part of we'll call it a civic education that can actually build resilience against anti-Semitism, but it certainly can't do it by itself. At the end of the day, the Holocaust teaches a number of important lessons. Some of those lessons are critical today, and they have less to do in a more direct way with anti-Semitism, but they include lessons of beware of the beginnings of authoritarianism. Right? You can understand that societies can unintentionally go down very difficult paths that lead to the marginalization and destruction of peoples, including Jews, but not exclusively Jews. And you can learn that through the Holocaust. But the Holocaust teaches some lessons better than others. One of those is anti-Semitism. But we also must teach the Holocaust on its own merits, because the Holocaust was a civilizational break akin to a revolution. All right, the world changed after the French Revolution. The world changed after the Holocaust. The world we built after the Holocaust, the foundational documents of things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and everything, they were all framed with the Holocaust in mind. I think it's no accident that just as we are starting to question those institutions we built in the shadow of the Holocaust, we're forgetting about the Holocaust. We need to treat it as a subject that's part of our shared history.
I don't mean to push back against this, only to say that, one of the aims of this project of the IHRA is to provide some practical solutions. And it is a practical challenge for educators, teacher trainers, curriculum developers, whoever it might be out there who is engaging with this work that we're doing here, that, asking teachers to become, more expert in the sort of the origins of Zionism, of the 2000 plus year history of anti-Semitism, all of these additional topics that are not specifically 1933 to 1945 or whatever, is kind of a big ask, given we know all the challenges that already exist just on that more limited bit. Is there a practical way forward for the sorts of ideas that you're proposing?
You have to go local. You can't impose one narrative on a different region if it doesn't make sense in that region. By and large, whether we're in the United States, or Canada, or Great Britain, or Serbia, or Finland, what are we teaching? We're mostly teaching the history of Nazi Germany to teach about the Holocaust. What that leads to is, unless you're German, the history of the Holocaust becomes something that happened over there instead of something that happened here. So the first step is to localize it. Make it a Finnish history, make it a Serbian history, make it a Canadian history. But then talk about the prehistory of the Holocaust, specifically the prehistory of your Jewish community before the Holocaust, before you can even get into the subject. You don't have to go into great detail, but if you're Lithuanian, you need to at least acknowledge that for the better part of 1,000 years, Jews lived in Lithuania and they contributed so much to what became the state of Lithuania and became such a center of Jewish life that, Vilnius was known as the Jerusalem of the North. But it's not taught that way. It's taught as 1941, Germans come in, they find these people called the Jews, they kill them. Every third person claims they have an uncle who rescued Jews, which was a mathematical impossibility given the devastation carried out on the Lithuanian Jewish community. And then everybody goes home from school. That's not how you teach the subject. You teach it from the local perspective. And it's messy and it's ugly. And the reality is that not everybody's uncle was a rescuer. Some uncles were collaborators, some uncles were perpetrators. And even for countries like the US, Canada, and Great Britain, we carry a measure of guilt. We either didn't let enough Jews into our country when they were able to flee Nazi German aggression. We took decisions during the course of the conduct of war to make the mass murder of Jews a secondary issue. Or in the immediate post-war era, we failed to provide enough care and maintenance for the Jewish communities that were occasionally still being subjected to violence and marginalization.
Thank you, Rob. I completely appreciate you talking about the local, because in the work that we do, and I think in a lot of the work that we're speaking about around the IHRA, it really is talking to the local perspective, the local history, the local context, and the local Jewish community or lack thereof, and why that's the case. So I think that local connection matters. I think we have to, and I'm going to push back a little bit, be careful when we talk about lessons, because I think at the end of the day, in a post-Holocaust era, like you said, in a world where things were changing and the Human Rights Declaration, everything we talk about has become around human rights. But what's happened is we've universalized the message, and we've done such a good job at speaking about human rights, racism, and hatred in all its forms that we've removed the Jewishness out of it, so that now when we're revisiting the questions around anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and teaching and talking about the Holocaust without looking at your Jewish connection, whether your local Jewish connection, like super local, like your town, or just your national Jewish connection. So I feel like there's a lot of sensitivity around the topic, because while the Holocaust ended 80 years ago, what's happening now feels so raw that people want to create connections. Should they?
I agree that the drive to universalization is incredibly risky. There is a reality that at times almost any group can become victims, but the realities of the moment mean that most groups aren't. Most of us are probably more likely to become bystanders, and a percentage of us are likely to become perpetrators. But if we universalize to the point where it doesn't matter, that is wrong. It diminishes the subject. It's a moral insult to the victims and survivors. The corruption of language, especially the language of human rights, is something that Holocaust education needs to, or Holocaust research needs to begin to address. I mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for a reason. It was framed with the crime we recognize as the Holocaust in mind, as were many other conventions and pacts born that influenced the modern human rights movement. But what we've seen, by and large, since the Six-Day War, is the steady removal of Jews from human rights discourse. That's a huge problem. It's a larger discussion, and partially due to the corruption of language, the corruption of the language of human rights, the corruption of our understanding of genocide, and the misuse of the term Holocaust. But the corruption of language is also a bigger discussion that we need to have within other parts of Holocaust history, right? Adolf Hitler, as early as 1934, said that he was consolidating the state to protect and preserve democracy. These are things that we've seen before. Language is corrupted by authoritarians for all manner of ends. And it's sometimes a phenomenon on the left. Think of Hugo Chavez or Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. Sometimes it's a phenomenon on the right. And sometimes it's a phenomenon of states that intermingle nationalism and religion, such as the Russian Federation or Erdogan's Turkey. But the language of democracy can be used to destroy democracy, just as the language of human rights can be used to destroy our responsibility to protect all citizens, including Jews. The third piece that we need to address within this delicate balance of how do we universalize responsibly is by doing a better job of acknowledging that the Holocaust was the intentional murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazis and their collaborators. And at the same time, there were millions of others killed by the Nazis and their collaborators for different reasons. Groups like the Roma, the LGBTQ plus community, as we would define them today, disabled people, Soviet POWs, Europeans of African descent, forced laborers, particularly from Ukraine and Poland, ethnic Poles, ethnic Serbs, all of these other communities who were killed for different reasons, but in ways that sometimes parallel the Jewish experience. If we look at them as separate, it doesn't help anybody. But if we look at those intersections and parallels, it actually has the potential to begin uniting people behind understanding the Jewish experience a little bit better. I've seen this in action with the Ukrainian community in Chicago, for example. I think we've seen elements of this in Poland, especially over the last few years. We have to teach these histories somewhat side by side, while also maintaining respect for what makes each of them unique.
Throughout this conversation, we've gone in a lot of different directions. I mean, I think that the takeaway is obviously that, as an organization whose central mission is about educating, researching, and commemorating about the Holocaust, there is clearly a connection, to also educating against anti-Semitism. We're trying to get a better understanding of what that connection actually looks like, both in theory and in practice. And I think that this conversation has done a lot of the work to get us closer to understanding what that is. And I hope people who are watching this or listening to this will join us on this journey. We're going to hear from a lot of other sort of case studies from around the world of people who've been trying to tackle this very problem. And so with that, I want to just say, Dr. Robert Williams, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I've learned a lot, and I hope others have as well. So thank you.
All right. Thank you both. It's nice to see you.